No problem. Good evening, everyone. My name is Annette Snyder. I am co-convener along with Kenneth Walker of the In the Loop Ministry Group of the Presbytery of Baltimore. And we are the sponsors of this Be More Human series. We've been doing this once a month since September in the hopes that we can raise awareness of social injustice, give us an opportunity for some dialogue and hopefully even action. Tonight, we're going to be talking about liberation theology, and I am going to turn this over to our very own James Parks, who is past moderator of our presbytery and currently serves on the investment loan program board of the PCUSA. So James, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Annette. I'm also on the Presbyterian Mission Agency board as well. Welcome, everyone. Welcome to what I hope is going to be a very lively discussion about liberation theology, its implications, and its impact. Liberation theology teaches that the God of the Gospels has a deep love for the poor, the outcast, the oppressed, and the ostracized. It is built on the idea that the church's mission is the same mission that Jesus claims for himself in Luke 4:18-19, where he says, "The Spirit of the Lord is on me, because he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim freedom to the prisoners and recovery of sight for the blind, to set the oppressed free and to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." Actually, one of the best definitions I've heard of liberation theology comes from two of our panelists tonight, the Reverend Dr. Alonzo Johnson and the Reverend Shania Leonard. They say, and I quote, "Born out of roots in Latin American cultural uprising and made popular in the US by James Cone, liberation theology is a lens for which we can understand God and the need for Jesus. It emphasizes the overall arching Christian themes of justice and love, especially and notably for those most marginalized by systems of oppression. Liberation theology is a framework for understanding the need for a Savior and a God who cares deeply for those that the world and the church have often forgotten, disregarded, stepped on and over, relegated to the margins of life, and otherwise don't even see. Liberation theology has an emphasis on the political, social, economic, cultural, and institutional critical analysis of power in the society, including but not limited to faith and the church. With that definition in mind, we are going to examine liberation theology from various aspects. We're going to have 4 panelists. Each one is going to speak for 15 minutes, and then after that, we will be open for questions. I will introduce them, each one, as they are presenting. Our first presenter is going to be the Reverend Dr. Alonzo Johnson. Reverend Dr. Johnson is the PCSUA's coordinator for the Committee on the Self-Development of People program. He is the convener of the Education Roundtable, which is a group working with the Educate a Child, Transform the World domestic initiative. He has 25 years of experience in urban, congregational-based organizing, youth education, creative arts, peacemaking, anti-racism, anti-poverty, anti-violence, and social justice ministries. Reverend Dr. Johnson was a pastor at an urban church in Philadelphia for 12 years and was a volunteer chaplain in prison ministry for 9. He also has a certificate in Black Church Studies from Louisville Presbyterian Theological Seminary, my alma mater. And he is going to discuss how liberation theology has impacted African Americans. Reverend Johnson, it's all yours.
Thank you, Brother James, and thank you all for the opportunity to be here with you, the incredible Baltimore Presbytery. I'm excited to be able to share this time with you and excited to talk about a theology that has been really powerful and pervasive, and especially in a time like this, a theology that has really been prophetic in so much that it speaks to many of the issues that we see happening today. And so when I think about, Black Lives Matter, and I think about the issues that are at stake, that the liberation theology is really key to addressing and understanding those issues. I'm going to start with I'm going to try to go as fast as I can with a very quick PowerPoint. There is a long-running joke that says, what does it mean when a pastor look at their watch before they preach? And the answer to that joke, it means nothing. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to get this to you so I can get our time going. Hold on one second. I'm just looking for my piece here. Of course, it happens when I need this to happen this way. I'll start this way as I'm doing this. I'll speak to you. Just as Brother Parks mentioned, liberation theology comes out of Latin America, right? This is a Latin American product. And it comes out of the concern for the poor. Just very simply, the concern for the poor. And in many ways, liberation theology is an analysis, right? It's analysis about how, about power and who gets to have power, the power relations in our country. But also, it's, it comes out of recognizing the God that's in those who struggle, right? Traditionally, this has not been a motif in which to understand God. God comes, God saves, but this idea of the God who actually struggles, the God who knows pain, the God who knows what it's like to be thrown out of things, kicked out, pushed aside. And so these particular types of things are really incredibly important as we dig into this. Here we go. And I'm going to go to our beginning here. We'll start it off with this figure. Many of you know Gustavo Gutierrez. He is considered to be the father of liberation theology. And Gutierrez was he is a Peruvian Catholic priest who's still alive, whose major theological focus was to connect salvation and liberation of Jesus Christ to what he calls God's preferential option for the poor, or the emphasis on improving the material conditions of the impoverished, right? And so again, this is a pretty radical way of looking at who God is, who God is in Revelation, who God appears to be. And Gutierrez's methodology is often critical of the systems that create social and economic injustice and exploitation he believes to be responsible for poverty in Latin America. And the central pastoral question of Gutierrez's work is, how do we convey to the poor that God actually loves them, that God is a part of them? And I think, especially as we think about the work that we do in churches, and especially in a city like Baltimore, how do we convey to those who struggle in our communities that God loves them? And one of his most read books is A Theology of Liberation. I put the picture in the center of one that was one of the most kind of powerful, iconic images that appeared on a particular pressing of his books. And I think it gets at the heart of this kind of gnarly, hurt, worn, beaten Christ, right? Not a sanitary image. And so, Gustavo kicks it off. But then, there were other notable figures in the early liberation theology movement, right? All the kind of runners up, so to speak, right? One being the incredible Juan, hold on a second, sorry about that. Juan Luis Segundo, who was a Jesuit priest and from Uruguay, right? Is a theologian who was a critical figure in the liberation theology movement. And these theologians communicated with each other. They talked about the kind of similarities in what they've seen in their context. And he was a physician by training and talked a lot about, how poverty affects the communities and the bodies of people, what malnourishment does to people. and really looking at, how does God speak to these, the pain and some of the detailed issues that are happening in communities where people are starving, people are trampled underfoot by, and in many of these cases, by death armies, juntas, Leonardo Boff, former Brazilian priest. And he was an early proponent of the liberation theology as well, and helped people realize a link between anti-poverty and human spirituality. He had this incredible book called The Lord's Prayer, which was a kind of liberation theology hermeneutic put onto the Lord's Prayer, which is really powerful. And then, of course, there's Oscar Romero, who was Saint Oscar Romero. He was El Salvadorian Archbishop, who was an outspoken critic of the right-wing military juntas. Not at first, he was very conservative, and then had a change of heart and change of mind when he started to see the suffering of the people. He began to see unreserved, unwavering advocacy for the poor and human rights, for those who face violence, and which was rampant in his context, and political repression. Of course, we know well, political repression in the form of violence and a form of police brutality and these kinds of things. And he was killed on March 24th. He was shot by a right-wing assailant during Mass, and it's believed by some that he actually died at the communion table. So that's the legendary story of Oscar Romero, dying right in the context of Mass, serving, doing the ultimate work in the Lord, serving the Lord and serving the people. So, and it's important to kind of bring these figures, these brown figures, right? And I say brown on purpose as we talk about Black and brown communities, because this is where this particular theological perspective gained its life. And of course, we cannot get at the exact question about what liberation theology means historically and biblically without mentioning the work of Black pioneer theologian James Cone. Cone, who taught at Union, Black liberation theology amalgamated religious practice and faith with depth political analysis, activism, and social change for the advancement of the Black community. And it was an affirmation of Black humanity, which and emancipates Black people from racism and white supremacy. Remember, this is the 60s, 70s. Civil rights was we saw the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr., the rise of the Black Power movement. And James Cone was figuring, how do we give voice to this powerful movement that's lifting up Black humanity? It's so amazing when you read this and you can see the almost the connections with things like with movements like Black Lives Matter. This idea of lifting up Black humanity and seeing that God has a preferential option for the oppressed, and particularly for the oppressed, Black humanity, lifting up Jesus as personifying Blackness in many ways. And the tenets of liberation theology through the lens of the Black experience, right? His 1969 book, Black Theology and Black Power, made it key connections between Jesus Christ and the plight of Black people in the United States. And these connections are also made, of course, in The Cross and the Lynching Tree. So if you've read that book, you get to see those connections that Cone makes, and also the connections with the cross, but also what Black theology does is criticizes white Christianity for its hypocrisy. On the one hand, lifting up the cross, and on the other hand, hanging people. And not seeing the plight of Jesus and the very people that have been lynched and hung. It's important to mention this figure, Presbyterian, right? We all know who this is. This is Gerard Wilmore, the late Reverend Dr. Gerard Wilmore. And in concert with James Cone, talked about Black liberation being intimately connected with the Black church tradition, that you can't look at Black liberation without looking at the Black church tradition. And as a historian, as an activist, Wilmore defines the Black church by three factors, which you can see connects to this idea of Black liberation. One is the quest for independence from white control. Two, the revalorization of the image of Africa and African people. And three, the acceptance of protest and agitation as theological prerequisites for Black liberation and a liberation for all people. So these are really, integral aspects of what Black liberation theology and its connection to the Black church. I wish we had enough time, because I have a funny story to tell about him and also about James Cone, but we don't have time for that. But we cannot talk about any of these figures without talking about this figure. One of the most powerful, as we've mentioned, the Black Church's connection with the formation of Black liberation theology. It's important we have to mention Reverend Dr. Howard Thurman and his important work, Jesus and the Disinherited, which predates Cone, right? His book was written as a manual of resistance for those who are poor to stand up. He's famous for the quote that the poor has their backs against the wall. You know, and this is powerful because Thurman, he links Jesus as one who understands the pain and struggle of those who are oppressed. And it's noteworthy to mention as we talk about Cone and as we talk about Gerard Wilmore, as the coordinator of self-development of people came out of this movement, right? This awareness of Black power came out of the Black Manifesto. James Foreman coming to the Presbyterian Church, invited by Black folk within the church to talk about racism and talk about reparations. And so SDOP, self-development of people, comes out of this incredible history of Black theology and being able to define what Black theology is. And, you know, and Thurman was very influential to the civil rights movement. And so, you know, again, that connection between Black theology and also the Black church are really important because it was lifting up, just as Gerard Wilmore lifted up, this idea of protest, this idea of analysis, this idea of power. Of course, we think about scriptural motifs, right? We think about why is liberation theology important in scriptural motifs, right? For us, it was the freedom story, right? For African-American communities, it was the freedom story. It is the end, the abolishment of slavery. God does not like oppression. God does not like slavery. Black folk were able to connect to the exile, able to connect to the plight of ancient Israel, right? I'll put these pictures up here. You see the one, this idea of the Black Moses and how this plays into the Black church, right? Black theology lifts up the Moseses in our culture, right? Like Harriet Tubman, who was a powerful Moses figure, the idea of freedom. And Black church faith is punctuated by the preaching, by the word, by the sermonic tradition. In the New Testament, it is a liberating Jesus, right? It is a Jesus that loves, walks, cares, heals, listens to the concerns, and goes up against the systems of oppression. So this is our theological, you know, Black liberation is concerned with these particular types of motifs and lifting them up, as they have been integral parts of Black music, Black worship, and at the center. And even though there have over the years been, you know, kind of a divided mind, as Raphael Warnock says, and a tension, the Black liberation theology really lifts up these motifs of God as liberator and God that does not like oppression. And this is the last piece. And of course, biblically, Black liberation theology also puts forward the profound questions about the way that European dominant culture depicts biblical characters and motifs of the divine as white, right? For many of us, it's going to church and looking at your stained glass windows, right? Black liberation theology as an aspect of the Black church raises the concern that Black people cannot identify with what African-American scholar Kane Hope Felder says in his book, Troubling the Waters, or Troubling Biblical Waters. He calls it a historical distortion. And the fact that you know, that Black folk cannot connect with the images you see on your screen right now. How do Black people connect with a Jesus that looks like blonde hair, blue eye, a Jesus that is very European, a Jesus that probably comes more out of this, you know, medieval Christ than a Jesus that knows oppression, this kind of Christus Victor white colonial Jesus, and the concepts like the Hamitic curse, right? These are the kinds of things that Black theology wants to address and confront, these white supremacist distortions. And so it's important to kind of lift those pieces up, and that's basically it for that presentation. But I think it's important as we look at, you know, what, you know, in the 15 minutes that I had, to really frame and shape for you the connection with Black liberation theology. That's what it looks like, liberation theology in the Black community, and how it's been connected to the Black church and the powerful entity of the Black church. Remember, at one particular point in time, the Black church was the everything for the Black community. It was the be all and end all of everything. Education, you were able to get all types of things there. So making those connections and understanding the power of critical analysis, political analysis, that to be faithful is already, Jesus is political, nonpartisan political, but political in asking the questions about who gets to eat and who doesn't, right? And liberation theology does this. And so hopefully this will give you a sense of, I mean, many of you have been through seminary and probably have read many of these pieces, but I think especially how it attacked it for us as leaders, as church people today, to understand the power and the emphasis of the oppressed. And that's the great gift we get from liberation theology, recognizing God and those who are hurting and who are casted out. So I think that that's one of the great powerful gifts that we get from Black liberation theology, and the fact that it has a long life in the Black church. And and Shania will talk more about what grew out of that, because at the same time, the criticisms that are leveled for Black liberation theology, especially towards James Cone, that it was basically a male affair, right? It was just directed at Black men, as many Black women did not have power in churches and power in society. And so, many womanist theologians would confront James Cone at Union and say, what does this have to say to Black women? And that this is great and everything, but it's still exclusive and it's not, liberating to the fullest. And so that'd be a way to kind of end that piece.
Thank you, Alonzo. You actually just led right into my next introduction, which is for Shania. The Reverend Shania Leonard describes herself as all right, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Oh, okay, I'm sorry. My microphone went out there. Reverend Shania Leonard is a pastor, a teacher, a consultant, a community activist, and a 21st century abolitionist. They currently carry out their justice mandate as the associate for the Presbyterian Church. In that role, Reverend Leonard is working to dismantle racism, homophobia, white supremacy, and various forms of discrimination by bringing the denomination to move into a more inclusive and intersectional reality. Shania was founder and organizing pastor of the Judah Fellowship, the only predominantly Black affirming faith community in Western Pennsylvania. They live their life by Micah 6:8 and the mantra of Assata Shakur, which states, "It is our duty to fight for our freedom. It is our duty to win. We must love one and protect one another. We have nothing to lose but our chains." Shania will discuss how women and the LGBTQ community are using liberation theology. Shania, it's all yours.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, buenas tardes, buenos dias. Hello, everyone. I am the Reverend Shania D. Leonard. My pronouns are they and them, and I am super excited to be here with you, Baltimore Presbytery. I always never miss a chance to say that I'm from right up the street in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. So I feel East Coast love, even though I'm currently stationed here in Louisville, Kentucky. I apologize for my background. I had to run downstairs in my house because the internet in Louisville, Kentucky is the worst in the country, I am convinced. And so please forgive the background of my refrigerator and my protein shakes on top. I'm going to share my screen with you right now. And although my focus is mainly on the LGBTQIA community, I will be discussing women as well. And so, can you all see my screen without a problem?
There we go.
Yes.
Okay. All right. It might be a small delay. Once again, I am in Louisville, where the internet is apparently run by small mice on a wheel underneath the city. And so James already read the definition of liberation theology that myself and Alonzo have constructed together. I will read it one more time because I think it informs the discussion in a way that is necessary. Born out of the roots in Latin American culture uprising, which Alonzo so very masterfully laid out for us and made popular in the US by James Cone, liberation theology is the lens for which we can understand God and the need for Jesus. It emphasizes the overall arching Christian themes of justice and love, which are epitome for our faith, especially and notably for those most marginalized by systems of oppression. Liberation theology is a framework for understanding the need for a savior and a God who cares deeply for those, the world, and let me be clear, the church, as we stand indicted by our own selves, have often forgot, disregarded, stepped over and on, relegated to the margins of life, and otherwise don't even see or acknowledge. Liberation theology has an emphasis on the political, social, economic, cultural, and institutional critical analysis of power structures in society, including but not limited to faith and the church. And I know that's a mouthful, but I wanted to put it before you because it's an indictment on the need for this framework and the need for the church to take ownership of how we have been a part of the problem and stand to be a part of the solution as well. And so just a brief history of LGBTQIA plus liberation starts in the 1960s, and it starts as we are seeing a rise in the civil rights movement as it concerns Black folks in this country. What we don't know for most of us is that there's also a rise in the movement for liberation for LGBTQIA people too. This really kicks off in the 1960s in a bar called Stonewall in New York City. And it's led, let me be clear, that it's led by two women of color, two trans women of color. That's important because what that says is that at the beginning of this period of liberation, there's an intersectional lens that happens from the beginning. And so what happens, we think that the Stonewall Riots is all about a bunch of, let's be clear, people think that it's about a bunch of gay white men posing a riot, but what in fact it is that people are tired of the police harassing them for simply being who they are. Sound familiar? It's exactly what's going on in our country today and has been going on for a long time, and was also going on at the same time for those who are part of the civil rights movement for Black folks. And what happens is the reason why Marsha P. Johnson and Sylvia Rivera are credited for being the folks who kick off this movement is because they're the ones who stand up to police who come in that bar ready to arrest them for simply being who they are. They're the ones who throw the first brick. They're the ones who start the uprising. They're the ones who stand up and say enough is enough, which is exactly what liberation theology is based in. Enough is enough. And so that's where these two women come into play. The movement of liberation to change society norms and legalize oppression continues today, as there are still several states in this United States where it is legal to deny persons housing, employment, and services, even, get this, even if they are perceived as being members of the LGBTQIA community. If you are perceived as being a part of the community, you can be denied services, housing, and employment. You cannot pay for your ability to live in this country, to have adequate housing, basic human rights, if someone thinks you're gay. Furthermore, there are no federal protections for this same discrimination. There is not federal protections, even though the Supreme Court has legalized same-sex marriage as a common civil right. So what you have here is an issue of civil rights that in a movement that has been coming and moving for decades now. And whereas the movement for civil rights for African Americans or Black folks has had some advances, although we're still not there. We are still not to the promised land. We still not have reached the dream. As a Black person, I can say this, but as a queer person, I can say that we are much further behind the eight ball as people who are part of the LGBTQIA community. When you don't have the same basic human rights as everyone else, or civil rights as other people who have fought for them because of their skin tone and their skin color, and you don't have that based on who you are and who you love, we still have a problem in this country. Furthermore, the church has been a historical and fundamental driving force in the undergirding of discrimination experienced by this community. Our hands are not clean. The same way the church has an indictment on its back and in its history as it concerns racism in this country, as it concerns the removal and the ultimate dissemination of Indigenous and Native Americans, the same way the church hands are complicit and complacent when it comes to slavery is the same way the hands of the church are complicit and complacent when it comes to the discrimination against people based on who they love and how they show up in the world. And although some mainline denominations have policy that counters this, there's still, and I know that you can attest to this, a wide stigma for the queer community in faith circles. Otherwise, we wouldn't still have these issues going on. And one of the most public and politicized issues is with the Methodist Church right now, even as we speak. And so this has thus produced a counter mistrust from the faith community among many in the LGBTQIA community. Why would the LGBTQIA community trust and have a proclivity towards an institution that has caused them oppression, discrimination, and all forms of issues? And then thus the church has undergirded the legal system, the medical system, the housing system, and the economic systems of this country to continue to perpetuate the discrimination. This is something that women in this country have known as well. Women did not have the right to vote, did not have the right to lead, did not have the right to do all of the same things that men had for many years. Thus, the women's liberation movement, born in the need to right for vote back in the 20s, and then even more in the women's liberation movement of the 70s. Number two, also, we stand at the crux of an intersectional issue. And what do I mean by intersectional issue? So glad you asked me at the right time. Popularized by Kimberly Crenshaw, a lawyer in California, intersectional means that people who experience oppression because of various aspects of their identity. Thus, I remind you of the two women I mentioned in the beginning, Marsha P. Johnson and Sylvia Rivera. They were oppressed and marginalized even within their own community. Why do you ask? Because number one, they are women of color. One is a Latina sister, one is a Black sister. They both were murdered, nevertheless, and that's another story for another day. But then also on that, they have an intersectional oppression because they are women. That's also the issue. And then more so, even more than that, they are trans women. Do you not know that in this country, it is a growing epidemic for trans women, especially trans women of color, especially Black trans women, to be murdered, and their cases go unsolved year after year. Last year, we had the most highest number in recent years, over 40 trans women murdered in this country, and many of those cases unsolved. At the same time, we were experiencing the death and the murder and the public lynching of George Floyd. We also experienced the death, the murder, and the public lynching of Tony McDade down in Florida, who was a trans Black man. And that murder still goes unsolved. And so when we talk about liberation needed and liberation issues, we need to talk about the ongoing systems of oppression that are holding the LGBTQIA community down. Here, I just wanted to give you a visual. This is Sylvia Rivera and Marsha P. Johnson right here. These women both met a fate that was untimely, especially Marsha's death is still one of the Black trans women who's gone unsolved. She was found dead by the river, and we still don't know what killed her. I like to give you this visual as well. We often talk about the need for liberation, and the need for equity and equality, but do we ever talk about inclusion? If you look at these four little pictures, I love this cartoon because it does it so much clearer than I could ever say it. In the first box, we have equality. Equality means we all get the same box. We all get the same equal opportunity to see the game over the fence. Equity says, no, because I am at a disadvantage because of my height or because of my physical appearance, then I get more boxes than you do. And so thus equity says I get a bigger advantage because of what I've been through, from what I come from. And that's the equity that most Black folks in this country need every day because of what we've been through, and people of color in general. Liberation says you remove the fence. There's no barrier to the game, that we all have access. Liberation says there is nothing that stops us, therefore there is no more. But inclusion says not only will you have a removal of the barrier, but now you can also participate in activities. As you see, they now have uniforms. They are equal part of the game. They have gloves. They can participate. You see the clear difference and the progression of what beloved community looks like in the eyes of God and in what we should be striving for. This right here is liberation theology in cartoon form. And so this is just the 2 slides I just mentioned, where our General Assembly, thank God, the General Assembly of the Presbyterian Church USA has taken measures to be inclusive for those who experience oppression because of who they are. And this one right here is the affirming and celebrating the full dignity and humanity of all people of all gender identities. You can look this up on the PCUSA website. I won't hold you long. And this is another one also for the 223rd General Assembly, celebrating the gifts of people of diverse sexual orientations and gender identities in the life of the church. This is who we are because this is who we said we will be. And so whether you believe it or not, and whether you have an opinion or not, whether you think that being gay and all of that is a sin or not, this is what our church stands for. And this is the spot at intersection of liberation that we are now in. What does the Bible say? There are plenty of scriptures I could have included here, and I'm speaking fast because I only got 15 minutes and I want to wind it down here. But forgive me, and I got my preacher voice on, and I really don't know why. But but this is just 3 scriptures I lifted up here. I could have lifted up several more. There is therefore no longer Jew nor Greek. We know that one. Anyone united to the Lord becomes one spirit with God. There is no prerequisite in that scripture for your sexual orientation or your gender identity. It says anyone. And the same can be said for John 3:16, for whosoever. And then in Psalm 139, because people say you always use the New Testament and forget about the Old Testament. The God says that I knew you in your mother's womb, your innermost being. I knit you together in your mother's womb. Therefore, God knew exactly who you were going to be, who you were going to become, and who exactly you would represent yourself as in the world. There is no need to hide from God because God knows exactly who you are and loves you just the same. Key points of liberation, and I'll get out of your way. There's a need for the religious stigma to be removed, and thanks be to God for denominations like the Presbyterian Church who have worked towards that in policy. My job is to make sure we work towards that indeed. Their emphasis on inclusion and radical welcome in faith spaces is important. We can't just put it in our policy. We got to make sure it shows up. Remember, I talked about the liberation cartoon where we move from equality to inclusion. That's so important. The need for legalized protection for basic civil rights for the LGBTQIA community. It is an abomination that we are in 2021 and someone could be denied basic needs like housing and the need to work to feed themselves because someone perceives them as being a part of the LGBTQIA community. And then a shared investigation and prosecution for multiple targeted murders of trans Black women every year. And then law enforcement, medical communities, and a myriad of other systems and structures continuing training for medical professions. I'm a living witness of this. Every time I go into my doctor's office, as a person who is gender nonconforming, using they and them pronouns, it's a struggle. It's a struggle every time. And so there's continued need for training to happen, because this is a part of liberation, because education is a part of liberation. You don't have liberation without education. And so that's the continuing need for that. I thank you for letting me share my screen and my time. That's my time. I'm gonna move out the way because I don't want to get in trouble with James Park.
Thank you, Shania. You're not in trouble with me, trust me. Not at all. Joe Morrow has the unfortunate responsibility of coming after Shania Leonard. But Joe, I know, is up to the task. Our next speaker, Reverend Joe Morrow, is the Assistant Pastor for Evangelism and Community Engagement at Fourth Presbyterian Church in Chicago. Joe has worked extensively in congregational, nonprofit, higher education, and corporate settings. Previously, Joe worked as a partnership manager for the National Nonprofit Interfaith Youth Corps. Within the denomination, he has served in a number of roles, including the role in which I met him as member and chair of the Presbyterian Mission Agency Board. And as vice chair of the UPCUSA's Mission Responsibility Toward Investment Committee. He holds degrees from North Park Theological Seminary and Georgetown University, but he is most proud of his roles as husband, father, and a mostly lifelong Chicagoan. He will explore the global impact of liberation theology. Go ahead, Joe.
Thank you, James. Much appreciated. I'm not going to try to follow up Shania. I'm just going to try to lay a path for some additional knowledge and learning that they've highlighted, and so has Alonzo as well. Just a privilege to be with this group and to follow those two treasured colleagues in particular, serving on the Presbyterian Mission Agency Board. I had an opportunity to really see up close their work, their skills, their gifts for the church, and honored that they have taken on leadership roles for us and that we're able to really glean from their wisdom. So they really sort of laid the scene for you of liberation theology, how to define it, its implications in some historical as well as present day contexts. So I'm going to try to add a little bit more gloss on this. I should say I am not a liberation theology scholar. However, I'm someone who swims in the waters of liberation theology, who is buoyed by the strength that they provide. And I see myself as a practitioner on the ground, trying to figure out how to embody liberation theology on the streets of the city of Chicago. And in this great crossroads of Chicago, one of our third largest city in the US, one of the great American cities, how to model liberation in the crossroads of our city. So I'm going to speak to global theology and sort of global roots of liberation theology, in part because although I'm really focused and centered in Chicago, I have been very much influenced by intercultural background, by religious pluralism, cultural pluralism, by diversity of people from different ethnic and social locations, both here in the US and in other countries around the world. So I've been influenced by it, and I've kind of seen from my own small vantage point how these global shifts in theology have really become even more powerful over the past decades and into today. So let me speak first to sort of the history of liberation theology, its global roots. It's clearly a global phenomenon. Alonzo mentioned its roots in Latin America and the Latin American experience. I would say it's a little bit like a tree that's taken root in different soils and kind of found its own way to survive in different climates. You know, evergreen trees and palm trees are still trees, even though they exist in very different soils, very different elevations, very different kinds of precipitation. And liberation theology is similar. It's difficult in some ways to think about it as only being an export that originates from one location, whether it's Latin America or the US, and then goes to the other. It's gone back and forth, and it's been shared in mutual ways. And I think the encounter of liberation theologies with one another across the globe have really accelerated a global exchange from scholarship, activism, what we would in the Presbyterian Church USA would call mission, and political and economic and cultural vitality. Biblically, I would say, for me, a touchstone passage for liberation theology is Amos 9:7. in which the prophet, hearing the word of God, says, "Are you the Israelites? Aren't you the Israelites the same as the Ethiopians to me?" declares the Lord. Did I not bring Israel up from Egypt, the Philistines from Caphtor, and the Arameans from Kir? Now, the only stories we know biblically tend to be the stories about the Israelites. But I think this passage really illuminates for us that liberation is a phenomenon that is larger than the people of Israel. It's a universal phenomenon in many ways. And biblically, we are told to be aware that the exodus that one people is on is not the only exodus that there is among cultures and among peoples and among times and places. There are many exoduses. If we were to look at the biblical witness as both a theological text with historical insights, we see that there are narratives of liberation across many different cultures, many different societies. With that in mind, in the modern age, I don't think we can separate liberation theology from the phenomenon of colonialism, of globalization by empires, and the racialized world that those empires have produced. So I'm talking mainly empires from the European continent, though we can look at sort of imperial thinking even more expansively. But let's focus on that for a while, because I think it has a lot to do with the racialized experience we have today. So one of the helpful guides for me in understanding the theological implications of the experience of sort of globalization in the modern era, and we're really talking globalization since the 1600s. I think of the modern era, when I was an undergraduate studying political science in an international context, they would say the modern era starts 1648, Treaty of Westphalia. European powers start to come together and create nation states. Well, they're not just creating nation states, they're creating empires, and they're going out in the 1600s, really even before then, the 1400s, 1500s, they're in search of trade routes for economics superiority and supremacy, for political supremacy. And so the Dutch are looking for trade routes going around Africa to the Indian subcontinent. You have the British as well, looking for trade routes. So they're all over the Atlantic world, the French as well. And all of these empires are looking to not only gain advantage for themselves, but to understand who they are in light of these new peoples that they are encountering. And so that's where, for me, the work of Willie Jennings in his phenomenal book, Christian Imagination, really comes to mind, because Jennings gives us a theological understanding of what is happening at this time. And he does so by highlighting a couple of key figures. So he looks at figures like Jose de Acosta, who is a model Jesuit. Alonzo earlier talked about some Jesuit theologians in the 20th century who were models of liberation theology. But you go back a couple centuries and it's a different story. You have Jesuits, people who are very much trained in the European tradition and all that the intellectual tradition and all that it stands for, basically coming across people in a place like Peru, where Acosta was assigned, and comes across the native population in Peru and says, well, I don't know how to relate to these folks. I don't see them as my intellectual equals. And so then begins to frame them as essentially subhuman. And that kind of framing theologically is one that takes them, rips them out of their geographical context, their social context, their cultural context, and begins to turn them into commodities, turn them into parts for labor, turn them into the machinery of modernity. That kind of that kind of globalization, this globalization which takes apart people intellectually, culturally, takes apart their soul, and does so by the sword and the gun, is really the piece that liberation theology is responding to. These aren't the first empires ever. They're not going to be the last ones. But they do a couple things. I mentioned they really do displace and rip people out of their context. Jennings puts it this way, that human skin was asked to fly solo and speak for itself, not tied down to a culture, to a place. It also turned the native and indigenous peoples around the world into perpetual students, into people who are intellectually and technologically inferior. And so we can see this in the language of development, right? This modern notion that we want to develop materially, we want to develop other people around the world. But that development is not just material, it's intellectual, it's spiritual. It's saying you've got to climb the spiritual ladder, the intellectual ladder, and lo and behold, the Europeans happen to be at the top of it. So the response to this overwhelming construct of empire and colonialism and capitalism, really, they're all intertwined in their histories, and how to respond to them. That's where liberation theology comes into play. But one of the things that I think liberation theology does in a lot of different places is it helps to do what anthropologist James C. Scott called to separate dominant from hidden transcripts. Dominant transcripts are the narratives of life that colonizing peoples and governments and forces lay upon others. And those hidden transcripts are narratives of resistance. And so liberation theology is about creating a narrative of resistance. In Latin America, it really came, it found a lot of fertile soil in base communities that geographically got together of poor people or poorer people who used the institutions that they had to create places where they could begin to create life anew, create new narratives, talk about the scriptures in light of the experiences of the poor. Another place where I see this happening is in South Africa. If any of you have ever read the South African Constitution in 1983, I remember the first time I read this and was really shocked at how blatantly religious it is, but religious in a very colonialist kind of way. Here's an example. It says in the preamble, in humble submission to Almighty God, who controls the destinies of peoples and nations. You can hear the Presbyterian nod to predestination there, right? In the providence of God. It says, who gathered our forebears together from many lands and gave them this their own. Now, who's the they, right? Who are the forebears? The forebears are European forebears. You have the Dutch and you have the British coming from many lands and being given this land by God. No mention of who was in the land beforehand. No mention, for instance, of the Zulus in the land beforehand. And then it says, who has guided them from generation to generation. So again, this is the danger of thinking that there's only one Exodus and that, you know, my Exodus is the only Exodus in which God has ordained. And then who has wondrously delivered them from the dangers that beset them. So again, indigenous peoples not having an ability to be actual people, full bodied people, flesh and bone, but dangers, labeled dangers. I think it's really important then to see that a document like the Belhar Confession, one that our denomination has embraced, is a way of responding to the wayward theology, the distorted, the demented theology that you will find in a political document like the preamble to the South African Constitution in 1983. That's where the work of Alan Bozak, a liberation theologian who's well-known in Presbyterian circles here, has spoken to a lot of Presbyterians in the US. This is where his work in the Belhar Confession and that of others has really come into play. And Belhar, with its focus on unity that is only established in freedom and not under constraint, unity that brings together all the gifts of and the opportunities and the backgrounds and the convictions of many people and not just one, really is a liberationist document. As I close, I just want to say that there are other liberation other liberation theologies emerging that I want to point to. There's a liberation theology, I think, coming out of a place like Myanmar now. And any of you who've been following the news, Myanmar has been taken over by a military coup. And there are Muslims and Christians and Buddhists in that country that are beginning to come up with their own indigenous forms of liberation theologies to counter a political coup in their midst. So we need to also start paying attention to places like Myanmar, other sites of liberation around the world where that kind of re-narration of life under modernity, life under globalization, life under capitalism is happening.
Thank you, Joe. Last but not least, by any means, is our own McKenna Llewellyn. McKenna is a queer, disabled, almost pastor. She serves as the assistant director of the center, which is, as you know, the mission initiative of our presbytery, rooted in local partnership and relation-based community mission. And before coming to Baltimore, she served and taught in congregations in Memphis and Boston. Her theological training has focused on 20th and 21st century theologies of the body, especially feminist and womanist theologies, trauma and theology, and disability theology. McKenna will speak to us about the role of liberation theology for disabled persons. McKenna, almost Reverend Llewellyn.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, now you've gotten to hear from the all-stars of our denomination teaching and preaching, and you got to wrap it up with your hometown nerd. So I want to talk first a little bit about what disability is, because it's something that is all around us all the time, but we're not thinking about a lot yet. We will, I hope. Right now, because of the pandemic, we are in the single most significant growth of the disabled community in this country since polio. And we are not ready for it in any way, shape, or form. And we are more not ready for it in the church. So I'm so excited to talk about this. So what is disability? In the legal world and in the medical world, where we have to have descriptors to matter, disability broadly includes physical, developmental, intellectual, psychiatric, emotional, and any other form of disability that can fall under the Americans with Disabilities Act. But disabilities aren't always illnesses and don't always fall into this medical model of needing or wanting a cure. So in addition to these legal and medical models, I want to lift up my favorite, which is the social model of disability, which I think resonates with this liberation theology conversation very nicely. So because disability as a community or as a lens for understanding the world is often new for folks, I want to give an abridged reading of a children's book that's supposed to help kids learn their colors, but it's also helpful for adults reimagining disability. And it's called Winnie the Witch. And I'm going to share my screen. So bear with me with some ridiculousness. We always need a little bit more of that, right? Okay. Get my face out of the way. Present. So Winnie the Witch lives in a black house in the forest. Everything in her house is black. The outside, the inside, the carpets, the chairs, the bed, like everything, sheets, bathtub, all of it. Winnie the Witch lives in the house, obviously, with her cat, her wonderful black cat named Wilbur. He's very cute. He is Black like the rest of her house. And that is how the trouble begins, because Wilbur is all Black and has green eyes. So she can only see him when his eyes are open. But as you know, cats love to nap. And so sometimes she cannot see Wilbur. And she falls down the stairs, which is very painful for Winnie, very frustrating and painful for Wilbur. So she turns this cat bright green. But then she puts him out on the grass outside and she can't see him at all at any time because he's totally green and his eyes are green. And she trips over him in the garden and falls right into her rose bush, which again is very painful for Winnie and very frustrating and painful for Wilbur. So out of her anger, she waves her wand a bunch of times. As you can see, there's red and pink and blue and yellow. She changes Wilbur into a multicolored cat so that she can see him no matter where he is. And he feels very stupid because he's not a red and purple and green and yellow cat. He's a Black cat. So he climbs up to the tallest tree to hide, and all the birds laugh at him. And Winnie takes like one hot second and she realizes that Wilbur is sad and not himself. And so she calls him down from the tree. She turns him back into a Black cat, waves her wand over and over again, and her house isn't Black anymore. It's a yellow house with a red roof and a red door, white and red cushions. The carpet is green with pink roses. The bed is blue with pink and white sheets and pink blankets, and the bath is white. And now Winnie can see Wilbur no matter where he sits. So I hope you've all learned some colors, but also that you have, that's sort of the perfect encapsulation of the social model of disability. Let me get my notes back here. So this model says that I'm not disabled by my impairments, but that social forces create structures that disable me. Sometimes I have a mobility issue and I need a crutch to get around. Am I in need of fixing? No, I'm not disabled by my legs. I am disabled by stairs. I'm disabled by prejudice, by assumptions about my ability, by inaccessible services that could help me move around the world a little easier. In this model, disability isn't an individual problem, it's a social responsibility. So who is disabled? A lot of us. In the United States, up to 1 in 4 people, making us the largest minority group in the country. So I play in the disability sandbox because I have a personal stake, but I also love to play here because disability is an experience that forms connective tissue across experiences and across justice movements. So just some of those intersections. Police violence. Between 33 and 50% of people who are who experience violence from the police have a disability. Institutionalization. There are high numbers of people with disabilities in prisons and in long-term care facilities where the majority of harm perpetrated against disabled people happens. It's a gender and a queer issue because a higher number of queer people identify as having a disability too, and specifically a higher number of trans people identify as having a disability. It interconnects with economic justice. The CDC says that the percentage of disabled adults increases as income decreases. Specifically, just looking at mobility mobility disability. Mobility disability is 5 times as common among middle-aged people living below the poverty level compared to those with twice the poverty level. Since the New Deal, it has been fully legal to pay disabled people a sub-minimum wage. The average now is still $3.34 an hour. And then Shania talked about marriage equality earlier. There is no marriage equality for disabled people because if you get married and your assets total with your spouse more than the level that is allowed for you to have disability benefits, you lose your benefits, including your health care. So you have to choose marriage or benefits. Some more bad news. Church history since the Enlightenment hasn't been great for disabled people. Before that, there's some really interesting evidence for pre-Reformation unions, hazard pay for people working on church buildings because it was really dangerous to be up on scaffolding, and accommodations for priests. And my friend, Dr. Nicole Ryby, is doing really interesting work on this at Loyola University. But then we hit the Enlightenment and we have not a disappearance of disabled people, but a disappearing of them. So you start an era that values a particular kind of body and a particular expression of intellect as divine or close to divine. And there's a lot of not good news for disabled people because the disabled body becomes a less valuable body in these capitalist systems, and it becomes a less human body too. On this continent in particular, the Enlightenment tangles itself with the enslavement of African people and industrial eras that rely on human labor and horrific living conditions, and our nation creates whole new communities of disabled people. Then you have the rise of eugenics, and then Nazism, and then the increased practice of institutionalization of disabled people. People in largely white, wealthy denominations like ours are more likely to encounter disability and people with disabilities as recipients of their mission dollars or their outreach programs than as their leaders. Between our Enlightenment history, our white supremacist history, our backing of eugenics, our opposition to disability justice, disabled people in the church are invisible, an annoyance, or a theological affront to a vision of a world that doesn't have suffering or wounds in it anymore. So there's not really good news here until about 50 years ago. And you have to look mostly outside the church for it. If you look through disability rights activists' religious backgrounds, Christian voices are pretty absent. Lots of hippies, lots of non-religious people, lots of Jewish voices. There was involvement from queer activists in some of the protests, and especially in some of the Bay Area protests, Black Panthers coming in to support protests. And every once in a while, a church would come into the picture as like a site for something. But for the most part, the presence of Christian voices during this rights battle were opposition voices. Churches were some of the most vocal opponents of the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, and still are, 30 years after its passing into law, exempt from nearly all its provisions. The reasoning behind allowing religious institutions to not have to come under the ADA was that it would be too expensive to change our buildings. So I have personally thoroughly been enjoying guest preaching from my living room instead of having to crutch my way into everybody's pulpit. And I will miss that when the pandemic's over. This all makes the work of liberation theology even more important. It grows out of fundamental assumptions of liberation theology, this disability justice, that people are social minorities and they are connected, not just individuals trying to heal themselves or overcome something. And that people are tied together by their experiences and made into a community. And that community coming together has power. Not just power to speak back and dismantle systems, but also power to care for ourselves. We know how to care for ourselves well when we have the resources to do it, and we often do when we come together. So when we're talking about liberation for disabled people, the conversation extends into the world, but we are quite frankly not ready internally to even think externally about this issue. Forget social access to faith communities. We don't even have physical access to church buildings or raised pulpits. So there's really good theological work happening about disability. Some of that work is actually by disabled people. The Disabled God by Nancy Iceland was written about a disability community instead of about individual people. It was about a group that had been marginalized, not single people who needed to adapt or disappear. And Sharon Betcher is a newer, wild voice in this conversation. And she's doing really good work about disability and the spirit. Her work in particular has helped me reframe how I read about disability and healing in Scripture, which is really important as the church learns how to reimagine this in our midst. Some of this work is just putting on the lens and noticing. Exodus is a story about a traumatized and anxious people trying to leave and build a new life. And their leader is a disabled man whose first public acts are at the political seat of power with the help of an accommodation, with the help of someone who can speak for him. He's never healed of his speech impediment. God says, fine, I'll give you Aaron. Then there are all kinds of stories of leaders who have the same impediment, who have impediments, who are sick, who are, right? It's all throughout the Bible, who are never healed because they don't need a cure. They're just people moving around the world. Then you get into the Gospels and things get sort of hairy. So putting on these disability lenses helps us see that the medical model we're all carrying with us in the back of our mind that says that disability is something that needs to be healed and is about an individual person really clouds our vision when we're looking at gospel healing narratives. So Mark 2, where their friends lower their disabled friend through the roof, a lot of us might see that story as a healing story where Jesus makes one person's life better. But if we put on our disabled glasses, it's about a group of people who are willing to dig an accessible entrance. And it reminds us that accessibility requires creativity and working together, doing things that might seem totally absurd. And it also might require us to modify our buildings. The shift that Sharon Batcher really helped me make in understanding disability and contextualizing healing in Jesus's day is that disability wasn't primarily about sickness, but functioned as a way to identify rebellious ones in the midst of the community. Enslaved people who disobeyed their owners were injured to prevent escape or to make their work more painful. People who defied Roman authority were injured publicly to make an example of them. Only a couple of the people in Jesus's healing stories have said to have been disabled from birth. Most of the people who encounter him then have a chronic condition that developed later. Healing in the Gospels in our culture is often read as an individual getting a cure. But in that moment in time, and in theologies like liberation theology, where there is a collective, the disability was often the result of cruel punishment or retribution. And so that healing of a disabled body was so much more than a cure. It was a political statement that the disabling forces of Rome and of slavery had no place in God's kingdom that Jesus was building. So I could talk about this all night, but that's so much information, and I'll stop there.
Thank you, McKenna. Thank all of you for some very exciting discussions. I'd like to ask the panel one question, and then I'll open it up for all of the other participants to answer. And this is a question that is kind of it's a major question that has been on my mind for a good while, and that is the demographics of the United States are rapidly changing. By the next census, and definitely by the census of 2040, the United States will be a country that is majority people of color. How can our denomination, which we all love, but which is 90% white, highly educated, generally economically well off, find ways to care about people who are different and who are on the margins? And the second part of that question is, will we be able to survive if we don't? Now, who on the panel would like to take that one first?
I'll go.
Okay.
I think we need to understand that even looking at the question from that perspective centers the majority. It centers white supremacy culture. That the people on the margins are not the other necessarily, but they are the ones that God has called just like anybody else. And so we who represent any form of marginalized person need to wonder, how do we accept those who are currently the majority? What does it look like when we remix the narrative and change the situation? And so if the Presbyterian Church is going to remain relevant in any way and thus live into the reality of this country, it must understand that remaining centered on on a culture, on a liturgy, on a tradition that is centered in whiteness is not going to be what propels us to where God is already at work and where the Holy Spirit is moving. That we must lift up the voices of those who have often been left out and relegated to the darkness, and to a place where we are the places of normal, and the places of setting the example, and the places of where the church must come up to. Otherwise, quite frankly, as a practitioner of the faith, I say this very clearly: the Presbyterian Church will no longer be relevant. It will no longer exist.
Anybody else want to take that on?
Yeah, hard agree. When you first posed this question to me before the panel, you sort of gave a name to that person, to the representative of the majority white, wealthy denomination, and you called him Steve. So I've been talking back to Steve in my head as I've been thinking about this question all week. And on one hand, like, I don't have time for Steve. Like, there are a lot of days where I just don't. And Steve's had a lot of book studies to help him figure out how to get on board, and like, keep trying, Steve. And I don't have a lot of time for Steve sometimes because his wife Karen is making a mess. And because all of it, because it's enough work to, enough of a lift to work with people who are like actually interested in doing things like working toward justice for different communities. So if a church calls me to help them think about disability justice because they're starting to think about putting an elevator in, I'm going to talk to them. I'm not talking to Steve. On the other hand, right now, still, Steve is going to be one of the people who approves the project for the elevator and the funds for building renovations and ASL interpreters and large print hymnals. So sometimes I have to talk to Steve. And when I do, I have an advantage that other people on this panel don't. So Steve is going to care about Black people, brown people, queer people, women. Either he's going to make some really surprising discoveries about himself and his gender identity in his retirement years, or he's going to have proximity to the issue. Steve is never going to be Black, but Steve could get hit by a bus tomorrow, or get a cancer diagnosis, or dementia, or be sitting in a restaurant when a gunman walks in, or get COVID and develop neurological or pulmonary illnesses tomorrow. And no part of his world that he built, no amount of years of work or money saved or tithes or country club memberships are going to save him from it. And so his quality of life might be different for a while, but none of that is going to stop him from being disabled. So, in some ways, I have an easier road to getting Steve to care, because tomorrow Steve might have to care. But on the other side, like, right now, I want Steve to care so he funds this thing, so that the people that God is working with right now have a space to gather, that our community is a welcoming place for people who've been anathematized by the church. So, like, I don't know, like, there's only so many book studies I can tell Steve to go to before I'm just going to ask him for money and like trust that organizing that money and organizing people is going to create a holy place for the church to thrive as it goes forward.
Alonzo or Joe, did you want to dive in on that question?
Definitely, I'd like to. I think one of the things that we don't talk about is actually our faith. The problem is that we have not been really good as churches. We have not been good in transmitting the faith in the Reformed tradition. And when I say that, I say this. And the reason why this is good, this is an issue about caring about these issues, is because we have not made anti-racism. We have not made ableism. We have not made all the things that liberation theology has lifted up. We have not made those issues. We have not named them and put them in the teachings of Scripture. We have not made spiritual practices out of them. We have not, as the church, we have continued to move far and far away from the teachings of Jesus Christ. And I think that what happens is that because we become what I call Jesus light, we're more concerned about buildings. We're more concerned about buildings, and not, just as McKenna says, we're not concerned about building buildings in a good way. But I'm concerned that we have forgotten literally who we are. And I think one of the things about liberation theology is about identity. And I think we've forgotten who we are. We've forgotten that, you read anything about, you read Calvin's understanding of the poor, and it's pretty powerful. We have distanced ourselves from our confessions that say things like, we go against Nazism, we go against poverty, we will stand up against the systems. And what we've done is we've distanced ourselves from the Word of God, from Scripture, that basically lays out for us the ways that we're called to be God's people. And I think what happens is that we have been absent in our spiritual practices. How do we make anti-racism, anti-poverty spiritual practices? How do we look at communion in a way that talks about welcome, and communion in a way that talks about the kinds of things that are really, integral part of the issues that we're facing now? If we can't talk about the Imago Dei, for example, as I work with young people, where's the liberation conversation in the church about the systems that continue to keep keep young people in positions of not being empowered, that young people are going to prison, young people are dying, young people are dying at the hands of law enforcement. Where's the church? Where is it in our faith, our spiritual practices, that calls us out into the world to actually make a difference and say something? One theologian in this denomination says, if we're not going to care about children, if we're not going to care about the systems that continue to keep people down, if we're not going to care about those who are hurting, especially as it connects to young people, then we need to stop doing baptisms. Because the problem is, if we don't connect our faith and and what we believe to what is right, righteousness and justice being the same word, then we'll remain irrelevant. It'll just be, church will just be the museum of the past glorious God. The museum, and I wouldn't even say the past glorious God, the museum of the old way we used to do things. And we recognize that our buildings, our technology, everything is changing, everything is transforming. But the question is our theology, is our spiritual practices, are we keeping up with those particular types of things? So I would take it right to spiritual practices, like how we teaching people to love Jesus and to love others, the Imago Dei through Jesus.
Joe, did you want to?
Wow. I mean, a lot of great insights. I would just follow up to say, Alonzo, you made me think about the baptism I did yesterday, and its gravity, its significance for the kind of commitment that I need to make, as well as all of our congregation members need to make for our children. And I preached yesterday about Jesus's appearance to his disciples post-resurrection, in which they ask, are we seeing a ghost? And my fear is that not so much about our numbers per se, but about the ghost-like nature of our faith. Is it real or is it an illusion? Is it something of flesh and blood, of body and soul? Or is it simply a wisp in the air and it just evaporates and goes away when times get rough? So I want a faith, and I want a denomination that is body and soul, flesh and blood, truly resurrected faith. And I think the only way that can happen is for us to do the kinds of things that you all have been mentioning, which is to really integrate liberation theology and its attention to the marginalized and the oppressed within our biblical teaching and within our daily daily ministry, our everyday life, the way that we weave God into our discipleship, and a discipleship that goes beyond the borders of membership or, who's in this ministry, who's in this program. Be willing to disciple anybody and everybody, and be willing to do so in a way that helps them to question their place in this society in these times. One of the things I think liberation theology does well is to help us question modernity, help us question empire, help us question capitalism, Marxism, every kind of system that's out there that has been built in modern times. It helps us to question. And I hope that we might even begin to question, are we really as rich and powerful and monolithic in our demographics as we think we are? When I go out into congregations in our city, I realize we're actually not as monolithic as we think we are. We actually do know a lot of poor people who are living paycheck to paycheck. We are some of those folks, even though we might try to deny it or might try to make others feel more comfortable or make ourselves feel better by saying that's not us. But we are really more diverse, and we are more troubled in this society as Presbyterians than we think. And we need to own up to that, identify with that, and see it as a way towards solidarity.
All right, I want to open it up to any of the folks from In the Loop or any of the other participants who are with us. If you have a question, just raise your hand. Frank will recognize you, and we'll call on you. Are there any questions from anybody? Come on now, we've had a really good discussion. I know that there are some questions or comments.
I know Kenny's first.
All right.
Good evening, everyone. I love the discussion, but what really hit me was McKenna's presentation. You know about disabled people, you know about disabilities, but you never looked at it in the way that she described it. Well, I've never looked at it that way. So that was pretty much it was an eye opener for me. And everyone was great on their presentations, and I've learned a lot. But definitely looking at how disabled people have been marginalized, and that pretty much touched me tonight. So I want to thank everyone for their presentations and everything, and thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Kenny. I think one of my favorite ways to introduce disability in a congregation is by asking who's wearing contacts or eyeglasses, which I see a lot of you are. All of you are part of the disability community. You've just received an accommodation that makes you think you're not. And so I hope that reminder just of your own eyeglasses is a reminder of how disability accommodation is wonderful and magical, and like it's this form of resistance, and you wear them on your face all the time.
Deborah has a question or comment.
Yeah, thank you to all of you. I wanted to follow up a little bit more on the disability conversation. I just think even the word disability is divisive and putting people in a category. And I've heard other people use the term differently abled. And I was just wondering if you would comment on that and the use of that term.
Yeah. So there's a growing movement of people who are saying, I'm not differently abled, I am disabled, because of that social model that says the thing is not wrong with me. Just like I know you've seen me walking around presbytery meetings with a forearm crutch. I am not disabled by my mobility impairment. I am disabled by the stairs in that church. And so it means that that word disabled gives me access to that sort of broader way of envisioning what who I am and where I belong. It gives me access to a community of people using that language. All of us do things differently. Some of us are disabled by the world around us. Does that help? I know that word can feel so divisive, but it really is being strongly reclaimed right now. And actually, some people will say they don't even want to use the term people with a disability because you can just tack off the with. Just like you are not a person with blackness, you are a Black person. I am a disabled person. That's a part of me. It's not going to go away.
Any other questions or comments?
Annette,
I just want to remark on, I think it was, I'm not sure which one of the speakers, we spoke about so many interesting things and important things, but the use of language and how we inadvertently oppress people, the language and images. We use a PowerPoint at our church for services, and I am really pleased with the diverse images that we choose to use. And even at Easter, we had thought to use a black cloth draping the cross before Easter, and then a white cloth draping the cross after Easter, which we changed to a red and a white cloth. Because even that simple image, I think we often use black to express or describe problems and negative things, and often use white as being clean and pure in our theological language. You know, and there are other words we use that I think can be oppressive. So I just sort of remind us of that and hope that we'll use better language.
I wanted to speak, Annette. I think that it's really amazing you say that. I grew up in Newark, New Jersey, right? That's my home. And I went to a large mega church that my mom, was a member of. And she would, she'd drag us to church, right? And church was like school. 9 o'clock it started, and ended at 4, right? And this was, this non-denominational church, really long. And it was an enormous white picture of Jesus, like the ones that I put up. And it was actually one of those, which is like the Werner Salmon Jesus with like the little, party in the back and a little short haircut in the front, right? That Jesus that people know. And the thing that was amazing to me at this all Black church was to hear people talk about white supremacy, oppression, police brutality, prison, and all the things of oppression. And then to look up and see this white Jesus. And I said to my mother, I do not understand why, if white people are the problem, why is there a white Jesus on the wall? And my mom couldn't answer it. Nobody could answer this. And for me, this was really difficult to kind of, how do you process this, right? This white Jesus, but yet in a community that is facing oppression, right? And these are things that we have to be incredibly mindful of. The images that we use. We are political, whether we say we are or not. When churches say we're not political, if you don't have a rant in your church, you are making a political statement. If you have stained glass where Jesus is one color and is white, you are automatically making a political statement. And so there are the things that we have to be very clear. And what liberation theology does, it keeps analyzing, how we continue to marginalize, and that this is not a one and done. We have to continue to be aware of the ways that are, how we oppress, or people are oppressed, or people are left out, or people are disenfranchised. And it's really important. But it was those kind of questions when I was a kid, like, don't understand this connection. We got a white Jesus, but yet people have a problem with white folk. And it didn't make sense. And it still doesn't make sense to people.
And you were fortunate as a child to question that. Many of our children just internalize it and don't question it. And they have psychological impact of that as they go through life.
That's right.
It reminds me that, we often say, and I think this is in the Book of Order, that one of the marks of the church is that the word of God is truly preached and heard. And we do a lot of the emphasis on the preaching piece and not so much on the heard piece. And heard, to me, implies the word that is well received because it is well interpreted. it's in a language that I can understand. And that language, as you all have said, is not just about words, it's about images as well.
George Fisher has something to say.
Yeah,
Oops, I'm sorry. I muted you, my mistake.
I thought I'd gotten it. There we go. Thank you, Joe, for that emphasis on hearing. I was struck in several of the presentations by the way in which it was obvious to me, just to focus on the Latin American experience, the way, yes, liberation theology was articulated by all of the folks we've been listening to, but in effect, it developed in the Christian-based communities. And it was by their listening to what was happening, they're listening to and then articulating what the experience of the Christian-based communities, that this whole thing of liberation theology came through Latin America. And of course, James Cone was doing very much the same thing. To be honest, my problem with the Presbyterian Church today, as I experience it in the Baltimore Presbytery, is that the Black churches aren't listened to very much. The hotbed of experience that could make liberation theology real in this community, not just as an academic enterprise, but as something substantive, something incarnational, if you want, in this community. And we're not paying attention to it. We're not cultivating it. We're not giving them a voice. I think the fact that the In the Loop group has put this group together is a big step in the right direction. But we need to focus more on doing that and on listening to the experience in the Black community in Baltimore. And if we don't do that, James, I'm afraid the answer is that the Presbyterian Church will not be a very powerful influence in the future.
Are there any other folks from the Baltimore Presbytery who might like to respond to or comment on what George has just said? I think, George, I think you're absolutely right. That is a difficult situation, and it's one that's not only just the Baltimore Presbytery. I think it's one that is throughout the church. I doubt very seriously if there are many presbyteries where the experiences and the issues that are facing the Black churches are paramount in the idea of the presbytery, or in the mind of, or in the theology, or in the practices of the presbytery. And that was really, in a sense, one of the things I was trying to get at with my question. I do need to explain who Steve was that McKenna was talking about. When I posted to her, I told her that I was not to see what she sees when she looks at me, but to see a 60-year-old white man who's probably a banker or a lawyer or a doctor, who's been a Presbyterian all his life, who gives generously to the church, who works hard in his community, who gives money to the missions and to the Doctors Without Borders all the time, who quite frankly says, I'm doing everything I can. Why should I change? And quite frankly, I don't know any poor people. That was who Steve was that she was talking about. Are there any other questions from anyone, or any other comments?
I guess I can go ahead and speak. I'm unmuted. A question came up or a thought came up in our Dismantling Racism meeting. I guess it was last week because today's Monday. That a lot of the folks that are on with us today that attend the Be More Human series, that are on the Dismantling Racism team, are people who believe already and understand already. I was wondering what the panel thinks about how we can reach the people like Steve who don't feel a need to pay attention, or just aren't in the mode of wanting to hear or wanting to learn.
All right.
I'm asking the panel.
Who wants to tackle that one first?
I'll jump
Alonzo,
in.
did you just mute your picture? Nope.
I struggle with this question, Annette, and because there's part of me that says that, I'm gonna be quite honest with you all, Baltimore Presbyterian, lean in, I'm being honest. That feels like the shake the dust off your feet model that Jesus gives the disciples, and that I can only work with those who are willing to come to the table. If you're not willing to come to the table, I can't chase you and beat you over the head with the knowledge you're not even interested and open to receiving. And so this question, it baffles me, because even if we have different opinions, if you're willing to come to the table of a mutual understanding and conversation, then we have at least a starting point. But if we don't have a starting point, then what are we doing? It's like a marriage that should never be.
Amen, Shania. And I mean, look at all the people that are on this call. I mean, you matter. Like, the fact of, yeah, you may be the in group, but you are the powerful in group. You may be the ones that get it, but you are the ones that, you have enough that you can do this work. And I think that that's what's really powerful. We cannot always wait for folk to come along. And also, it's one of those kinds of things where you recognize who you have. The thing about, organizing is, you gotta know who you have, who's walking with you. And I think and this is not to ignore those who are not ready yet. Because that's not what this is about either. This is not, we don't want to not include, but if we're talking justice and you've got the people you've got to work. You've got work to do. And I think justice happened yesterday, right? Because Freddie Gray died. Because young people are being shot. We don't have time to negotiate with people as to what needs to happen. If you feel that call to do it, then we're called to do it. You're called to get out there. Sometimes, time is not over yet. Sometimes people change their views and say, hey, I see it, I get it. Sometimes they will not. But that cannot stop the call to justice that you have as the people you are. If it's folks on this call, it's not a matter of convincing people who don't have the same beliefs. It's a matter of doing God's will now and getting together, you all who are open to this, to do this now, because communities need you now. They need, poor folk need us now, yesterday. People who are struggling that are coming back into society from prison, they need us now. They need the church now. And if we wait and feel like we have to bring everybody along, it's never going to happen. Justice is, right now, we're called to act right now. And this is and this transcends political sides, right? It really is the politics of Jesus, about those who are hurting, those who are, those who are poor. When I'm in a room and I ask people who are Republicans or Democrats or anybody in between, do they love poverty? No one raises their hand and says, yes, I just love poverty. And so we would be open to where God is going to lead us to do what we need to do now. And that's that relevancy issue that Shania, I think, brings up. If we're going to be relevant, we got to act and be present now, because there are people who are ready now. And there are communities who are willing to tell us what it is we need to do if we're willing to listen and walk alongside.
Michelle Ward.
Good evening, everyone. I wanted to respond to George's question. I was really struck by the truth speaking that he brought, and I also was thinking about the idea of how there are no permanent enemies in organizing. That just because someone does not understand and align themselves with this liberative work. Doesn't mean that they can't in the future, but we can't wait for them to catch up. Because we have to act now. I think it's important to always have open hands, but I also don't want to do what has been described earlier, like chasing someone down to get them to understand, or getting them to join a book group and making them take the vitamins of this work so that way they can, you know, grow and learn. Because I feel a deep sense of urgency as a younger pastor in this denomination, knowing that most of the churches that our denomination is made of, like, all mostly have under 75 people, mostly white, mostly over 65. Like, our denomination is going to look entirely different in 25 years, and I don't know what that will be, and it will be changing right before my eyes. So my self-interest is in like figuring out ways to listen and then act on what we're hearing from churches of color and from the racial ethnic churches that are really vibrant, and the new worshiping communities that are really vibrant and more non-traditional. I think there's a lot of new life happening in our denomination, but we need to make sure that we are listening deeply and then acting on what we're hearing, even if it might seem too risky or too unfamiliar. Because if we don't say yes to that kind of life, our future will look a lot less bright, I think.
Sharice Jordan Moore, you had something to say.
Yes, I just wanted to say I was, George is a member of my congregation, my Black congregation, and George is a white member who is intentionally there and works on it. I'm a new Presbyterian, so I came to be a Presbyterian because I married into like a lifelong Presbyterian family, and just finally decided to go to the church because there are no perfect churches. So that was the church that I could engage with. And I'm struck by the Baltimore Presbytery that I was recently at one of the gatherings. I'm a commissioner there, and I was listening to all the mission work that is going on, and funds and resources sent to other countries and so on. And I'm not against that because, the struggle is global, but the Baltimore Presbytery is in Baltimore, where, there are 62% of Black people, many of whom are in poverty. And I'm just, there's kind of, I just think Alonzo says, the time is now. We're in another wave of the civil rights movement. And I am not, I'm a woman in my 60s. So I feel like I'm in probably, my 4th chapter, and, this is my legacy work. And I just think we need to, speak truth to power, because if the Baltimore Presbytery lets the Black churches go by the wayside and doesn't address that, it's not a good look. I mean, it's not right with Jesus, but it's not a good look either. And McKenna, I'm kind of with you that, we need to speak truth and take the money and make the space if we need to. That it's, I'm at the point where, kind of two memes. One thing that I've had lately is I'm not going to spend the rest of my Black life explaining white supremacy to white supremacists. And the other thing that meme that I have recently, and I think sometimes we fall into this, is that, Jesus, forgive me for trying to get a seat at some tables I should have flipped over. So we just have to be honest. We have to demand. And sometimes we do that, right? Really get comfortable and so on. My Presbyterian in-laws, our Black Presbyterian in-laws, there's the history of, I do genealogy, so the history of Presbyterians educating the slaves and so on, and thinking, we're very educated as Black Presbyterians, but we have to be out in the community. In the history of our churches, that because we're working on that in the Loop, is that when the church was first started, it was clearly the people were told that Black people weren't intellectual enough to be Presbyterians. And I think sometimes we don't want to go in and tell the truth. And, a lot of us feel like we're not listened to, but, because maybe we don't want to rock the boat as much, or we have a long history of being Presbyterian, and see, I don't have that. So I am willing to go in and rock the boat and say some things that might be controversial and make some demands, because, right, the presbytery is not paying me, so in any fashion. And I've been an activist. I come from Chicago, like my brother who spoke. Came here when I got married, and I just think that this work is so critical. And if the presbytery doesn't realize that it has a mission field right here in Baltimore, we should be ashamed of that.
We're working on it. Thank you. I'm just jumping in here, not to cut you off, but because Shania Leonard has to leave us. So I'm going to give her any parting words, an opportunity.
I did not mean to cut you off either. It was such a good comment and that you were raising in the room. I just want to say thank you, Baltimore Presbytery, for an opportunity to share. If you want to know more, give a little commercial here. You want to know more about gender and inclusion, I will be doing the second in a series of workshops for the denomination on June 29th. And you can go to the PCUSA Facebook page to see how to sign up for that. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you for the time. And to the other esteemed panelists, thank you so much for your wisdom, your insight, and your fortitude in your particular areas of expertise.
Thank you.
Thank you, Shania. Appreciate it. Are there any other comments, questions?
I want to make a quick comment.
All right.
I have I became Presbyterian and got excited about this work because of a Presbyterian in Baltimore, and that was Curtis Jones.
Yeah.
The Reverend Curtis Jones, because of his work, that's what fired me up about doing anti-poverty work. It was the work that Curtis Jones was doing out of Baltimore. It's also the work that my chair from STOP, Reverend Karen Brown, is doing. I got fired up because just watching what Curtis Jones has done. And so, Charisse, you'll find out that there are so many people within the Presbyterian tradition that are about activism, that are about education, that are about all just some of the things that Joseph lifted up. I think that when we discover that we have, among us, the tools, that we have the implements of education, we have a policy in the church to back us to do this work of activism. I think Chris Ioso is on this phone call, former AC SWAP policy. He could tell you the policies we have that lays out all the justice types of things that we should be doing and the things that the church said we are called to do. And so it was a Presbyterian social activist that got me excited about staying Presbyterian and staying engaged in this work of anti-poverty and anti-racism.
Okay, are there anyone else?
James, I know some folks have a hard stop at 8:30.
All right. I want to
Go
thank
ahead.
all of our panelists. I want to thank everyone who's joined us. I know there's much more to say, and hopefully maybe later on we will be able to continue this in another form, another time. Annette, it's back over to you.
All right, thanks, James. I can't say enough to the panel about how thankful we are and much more enlightened from your presentation. If the rest of you are like me, you're going to have to listen to the recording to hear all of this again, to get all of the meat and meaning out of it. It was fabulous. I want to take this opportunity to invite you all to our last Be More Human series for a while. We will take a break over the summer, but on May 17th, we're going to have a panel, a BIPOC panel, discussing their experiences with racism in the United States. And if BIPOC is a new term for you, that's Black, Indigenous, and people of color. We'll have Bulima Tafa from Cameroon, Johnny Laura, who originates from the Dominican Republic, Jose Lopez Chapa, who many of you know, who's first generation, whose family is from Mexico, and also Maria Wong, whose family comes from Hong Kong. Growing up in Baltimore, I had experienced racism and social injustice as a Black-white issue, and I'm just becoming more aware that it is more than that. So this panel will help us explore and understand how other folks from other cultures and ethnicities are experiencing racism as well. So please invite your friends to view the recording of this program, those folks that are not in choir that need to hear the message. I am mindful of what I was asking in terms of folks that aren't here with us to hear this, that we need an ingenious pyramid scheme where everyone invites someone else and invites someone else until we have a sort of a burgeoning field of people who have heard the message and believe. So thank you all for being with us tonight. And panel, again, thank each and every one of you. It was fabulous. And thank you, James, because you were my go-to guy. And you pulled it out. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, and good night, everyone.
Good night, everyone.
Thank you, James.